The only major complex that I didn't discuss is the cannabis complex. Now, this is one that is this is not an indole, and this is there are many anomalous things about cannabis. First of all, it's what's called a polyhydric alcohol, the only psychedelic polyhydric alcohol known to science. It's an extremely old plant. I mentioned last night the relationship of the metaphors of storytelling and weaving and language. And of course, hemp is a fiber plant. And we find hemp and mass go back to as late as PPNB, pre-pottery Neolithic B at Çatalhöyük. There are hemp mass. Well, it's very unlikely with tossing waste from weaving into fires and the oiliness of the seed and so forth, that the psychoactive properties of this thing were not discovered. Cannabis originates in Africa. Originates in Central Asia. The original species is Ruderales. And then very early in prehistory, it divided into the resin race, indica, and fiber races, and then it was carried across the land bridge, presumably, into North America, and that accounts for the sativa variant and so forth. Herodotus describes, interestingly enough, marijuana was used for thousands and thousands of years before it was smoked. One of the hardest things to wrap your mind around is the notion that until Columbus discovered the New World 500 years ago, no one in Europe had ever smoked or conceived of smoking anything. It was a New World cultural practice. And if you read Columbus's diary of when he landed in the New World, he was amazed. He wrote, "The natives drink smoke." That was the only way he could imagine. He said, "What are you doing?" And then, of course, it was less than 100 years before it was a major vice of the sophisticated raconteurs of Europe. Within 100 years of the introduction of tobacco into Europe, tobacco was being buried in the graves of Lapland shamans above the Arctic Circle. So the shamanic nature of tobacco was immediately recognized, even in the European context. Herodotus describes marijuana ingestion as a process somewhat like being in a sweat lodge and then pouring hemp seeds and hemp waste onto the hot rocks and letting it mingle with the steam in this closed space and deep breathing. But nobody ever had the notion of a pipe or anything like this. And it's very interesting, for many different reasons. One is that it's a new use for the human body, less than 500 years old in European culture. At Non Nok Thaw in northern Thailand, and in other Neolithic graves, they have found long bones, arm and leg bones, with burned out centers. And they don't know whether this was a marrow extraction procedure or it was a chillum. If you know what a chillum is a ceramic tube, narrow at one end and wide at the other, and you pack it with hash and tobacco, and then you hold it and you do this to it. Well, it may be that smoking was known in Asia in Neolithic times, but somehow died out in the pre-classical period and had to be reintroduced from the New World.
Terence, want to comment about Amanita muscaria?
Yes, good. I'm glad you reminded me. Amanita muscaria is perhaps the old world hallucinogen par excellence, at least in the opinion of Gordon Wasson and a lot of other scholars. The problem with it is it's extremely difficult to get a reliable, positive experience from it. Now, the reasons for this are complex. First of all, it's geographically variant, it's seasonally variant, and it's genetically variant. So only if you have lived in an ecosystem virtually your entire life and have inherited the accumulated knowledge from the shamanic elders of your tribe are you going to know whether you've got a good one or not. Nevertheless, Gordon Wasson tried to argue that it was the hallucinogen, the prototypic hallucinogen of prehistory that was being used by these Vedic peoples who invaded India. In fact, he thought it was soma. I think, and I had correspondence with him about it before he died, I think the soma question isn't settled, and it could well have been a coprophytic mushroom associated with the dung of cows. After all, the role of cattle in Indian religion is very central, and in fact the role of cattle in early religion generally is extremely central. I mean, you do not get goddess religion in the ancient Near East without cattle worship. Cattle and goddesses seem to go very much together. And on the other hand, you know, the Dionysian Mithraic complex is a bull cult, and it too can be traced back into time till it's just lost in remote antiquity. So yes, that's the Arctic mushroom used by Siberian shamans, and it's been made the prototypic hallucinogen because Siberian shamanism was made the prototype of all other shamanism, only because some anthropologist somewhere decided that would be a good idea. Someone told me that they went to the island of Iona, I think it is, which is where the Book of Kells was supposedly composed. And they said there were mushrooms everywhere, that it was just to be there is to be inescapably confronted with mushrooms. And yet this doesn't, no tradition, no mention. Yeah, off the coast of England. It's where St. Columba came. St. Columba came and reintroduced Christianity into England in the 900s. Christianity had died out in England. It was only in the advanced Celtic civilizations on the fringes of the British landmass that the Christian tradition was preserved.
The other connection, this may fascinate you or not, but the misinterpretation and deterioration of the etymology of hallucinogen into the delusional semantic meaning, kind of catalyzed in my brain how mythology has de-evolved into a lie. And if you look up the original meaning of mythology, it means the mutterings of eternity.
That's a great meaning. Yeah, the mutterings of eternity.
Mythos and the whole thing with Avalon being sort of that place between the world that one went to, the mystical part, and then Glastonbury, sort of the other place where all this Christianity existed. And when I was in a mushroom experience one time in a circle, and said I was a recovering Catholic, trying to evolve myself and find out what my mind was all about. And this one man, shaman student from down in the Amazon, he said, well, if you eat these mushrooms, you're going to be excommunicated because the Christians will tell you that once you eat the mushrooms, you're doomed forever to hell and Satan and the devils. Bullshit. You gotta be kidding. But I mean, where would that come from? Maybe the Christian control looked at these people and said, look, you just like paganism or everything, just like wipe out their connection with the other world.
Well, it's very interesting that when the Jesuits arrived in Mexico and talked to the Indians and found them eating these mushrooms, they said, what do you call it? They said, we call it Tiananakatl. Well, when they got their lexicons out and got that piece together, what Tiananakatl means is flesh of the gods. Well, the center of the Catholic mystery is the Eucharist, a sacrificial meal where a small wheaten wafer is believed to be transubstantiated into the body and blood of the Son of God. So then, to place the psychic experience which follows upon a good Holy Communion next to the psychic experience which follows on a good dose of mushrooms, clearly these guys said, this is competition we don't need. We're going to wipe this out. And it is interesting. I mean, think about this for a moment. We grow so inured to these religious forms. Think about the notion of instituting at the center of your religion a rite where you eat your God. And that is what is happening in Christianity. It suggests that this sacrificial meal idea, which can be traced back to even to pre-exilic traditions in Judaism, is probably a memory of a relationship to some kind of psychedelic experience of some sort. Okay, well, let me continue my survey.
I have a wonderful modern-day story about how cultural experience I lived in the Shinhorn community for a few years. And in the early 70s, mushrooms are not illegal in Scotland. I don't think they are still. They weren't in the early 70s. And in like 1969, 1970, a lot of people started coming to Findhorn, and people regularly ate mushrooms. And between 1970 and 1973, it was arguably the most creative time at Findhorn. And books and music was being done, and the community was being built, and performing arts, everything. And by 1974, 1975, it was no longer acceptable. And they were trying to just be a very proper state community, totally in line with the Christian Scottish environment around it, even though they still weren't illegal in Scotland. Of course, nobody does mushrooms in Northern Scotland. But and it's interesting, when I arrived at Findhorn in the early 80s, people had even forgotten that tradition had existed. And one person, though, when I was looking at the old pictures, said, how come people are so much happier back then? It looked like they're smiling in these old pictures. Oh, well, everybody was on mushrooms then. This was the man who had lived during that time. So that gradually died out. But it was interesting because he did them for years and years. And at the point that I talked to him, he as well felt like it was not proper spiritual growth and development to be using mushrooms.
Yeah, well, I think institutions will inevitably substitute a rite or a ritual for the authentic, for the real McCoy, because then priests can control the pipeline to God, and the parishioner can approach with offerings. And but if everybody can have a pipeline to deity, well, then the whole priest scam is put out of business. Done what?
Precisely what you're describing.
Suppressing?
No, substituted essentially a ritual, i.e. meditation or some kind of trip, for the experience, and then empowered the priest, i.e. kind of Buddhist masters. In other words, is that process that you're describing in Christianity, which
happened in Buddhism?
Yeah, in your opinion.
Well, Buddhism is a heresy on Hinduism. It was Hinduism that did the dirty work for Buddhism. By the time Buddha came along, it was all priestcraft was an ancient tradition in India. But as I'm sure many of you know, the Rig Vedas, which are these tremendous outpourings of poetry that these Indo-Aryan people created as they came out of Central Asia and into India, the Rig Vedas are entirely devoted to the praise of a mysterious plant, Soma. The 9th mandala of the Rig Veda says Soma is greater than Indra. Soma is greater than Vishnu. And it just lists the entire pantheon, says Soma is greater than all of these things. By the time Buddhism is getting rolling, Soma is a suppressed ancient tradition, and the soma sacrifice, which is still being done, is being done with inert materials. If you want to read on this, why read Watson's book on soma, and notice how it traces back to haoma, which is a yet older strata of religious ritual practice that was Zoroastrian and Iranian in origin. And it's very clear, that what we're talking about here is an intensely psychoactive plant, and there's great argument about what it was. Buddhism, because of the long historical record in the East, arises entirely within the historical context. So the suppression of the plant connection was in the earlier stratum of Hinduism. Okay, we discussed the Central Mexican complex. It has minor components, such as were mentioned here, Salvia divinorum, and there are others not chemically well understood, but also not widely or regularly used. But then as you pass down across the Darien Gap and into South America proper, there is just an explosion of available psychoactives. Not only the tropane complex of the Daturas, which now re-emerge in the subgenus Brugmansia, the arboreal Daturas, which we see around town as these ornamentals with the huge pendulous hanging white flowers. All of those tree Daturas, some with yellow, some with orange, some with red, some with white, some with purple flowers, originated in a very constrained area in the Andes and have been used for shamanic purposes for a long, long time. Also, coca is endemic to that part of South America, occurs nowhere else in the world naturally. But more interesting from my point of view are the tremendous proliferation of DMT cults and options based around two pharmacological approaches. One, you orally ingest DMT at the same time as you orally ingest an MAO inhibitor. MAO is monoamine oxidase. This is the enzyme system that oxidizes monoamines. That means makes them harmless. Monoamines are this whole family of drugs we're talking about, and many other things as well. But if you don't have any monoamine oxidase in your body, then monoamines in your body just stick around because the machinery to degrade them is inoperable. So there are what are called MAO inhibitors. This means you take this compound and it causes the monoamine oxidase in your body to be bound. It can no longer do its work. DMT ordinarily would be destroyed in the gut, in the intestine, the upper GI tract. But if you inhibit all the MAO in the upper GI tract, then the DMT is conveyed into the bloodstream, can cross the blood-brain barrier, and initiate a psychedelic experience. So this is the strategy of ayahuasca, also called yahe. North of the Caquetá, it's called yahe. South of the Caquetá, it's named in the Quechua language, ayahuasca. Now, this is a really fascinating thing for many reasons. First of all, this begins to look like the world's first truly designer drug. Because notice what's happening here. All these other things I've been talking about, peyote, mushrooms, datura, cannabis, what have you, are single plants that require very little preparation. Basically, find it, eat it. That's the way you prepare it. Ayahuasca is very different. It's composed of two plants, neither of which is active except in combination with the other. So somebody figured this out. Well, this may not sound like such an accomplishment until you stand in the Amazon basin and look around you and realize we're talking 50,000 species per square mile and, 50 million square miles. So how did anybody ever figure out that you take the leaves of the little bush and the bark of the woody vine and combine them in these proportions and boil them and concentrate it, and then you have this fantastic psychedelic drug? The only way that I can imagine is somebody told them. And my experience is that these plants talk, that this does not make sense to the rational and discerning mind. But nevertheless, it is possible for one plant to lead you on to another. A perfect example of this is actually in the chemical literature. Melvin Bristol was a student of Schultes in the late 60s, and he specialized in the Brugmansias, the arboreal daturas, and he went to the valley of the Sibundoy, and there they actually add the datura to the ayahuasca. And he took this ayahuasca, and while he was on it, the ayahuasca entity showed him a plant. He kept seeing this plant, and he couldn't get it out of his mind. And the next day, after they came down from the trip, he was collecting in the forest with Indians, and he came upon the plant, the exact plant that he had seen in his vision. Well, he thought that was pretty strange. So he made extensive collections of this plant, took it back to Harvard, analyzed it, and it was, in fact, psychoactive, did contain psychoactive alkaloids. So, see, it's that we're tiptoeing over the surface of some kind of mystery. We maybe can bring ourselves to accept that a voice could speak on mushrooms telling you that you should be kinder to your children or love your mother and not be so hard on yourself. But it's a real leap for us to believe that a plant could tell you, you know that plant over there? Analyze that sucker. And, in other words, real information, not information subject to personal interpretation. The whole of the Amazonian narcotic complex, as it's called in the old literature, is based on activation of DMT by one strategy or another, either drinking this ghastly beverage, as the literature calls it, the psychedelic beverage, ayahuasca, drinking this beverage, or as you go east into the lowlands, the ayahuasca complex is replaced by what's called the snuff complex. And it is based around a number of species of myristicaceous trees. The myristicaceae is the same family as nutmeg occurs in, though nutmeg is an old world member of the genus. But several members of the myristicaceae contain DMT in the inner bark exudate. And these Indians you go out before dawn, before the first rays of sunlight strike the tree, because when that happens, this resin retracts. So before dawn, and they then strip the bark from the cold side of the tree, and they actually put their hands on both sides and determine the coolest side of the tree. Then they strip these long strips of bark back, then you take them back to the village, build a fire and let it burn to coals, and then spread the coals out. Lay these long strips of bark on the coals with the wounded side up, the clean inner side up, and this orange resin will be forced out of the bark and onto the surface. And then you can go along with a scraper of some sort, gather this stuff up, put it in a pot, cook it down, grind that in a mortar and pestle, and then you have a dandy paralytic arrow poison, which can also be honked up as an outlandish hallucinogenic snuff. And there are many stories of these Yanomamo and Waika people going out on the hunt and honking up their supply of drugs and just getting their poison arrows out and scraping off the points so the guys can get a buzz on and won't have to go back to the village. Well, it's a very interesting complex. It hasn't been very much researched by Westerners, and the reason is easy to figure out why. Here's how you take this stuff. You get with your buddy, and you have a bamboo tube. Maybe some of you remember this from the Emerald Forest. You have a bamboo tube about this long. You pack about this much of it with this ground bark exudate. And then you hunker down in front of your friend, put the thing with the loaded end into your nostril. Your friend takes a huge inhalation of air and then blasts on the end of this thing and just drives this stuff up into your sinus cavities. Well, everything goes violet. You scream, you salivate outlandishly, you fall over backwards, and by the time you've gotten yourself together, your friend has repacked the other side and is ready to give you that. And then you do that. It goes purple again, you scream, you salivate, you fall over, and then people usually say something like, good. Or far out, right.
Hell with that Holy Communion crap.
And then you see, I'm sure you guys have seen Napoleon Chagnon did a film and Juan Downey did a film. This is great filmic material because in these Waika villages, this has actually become, I wouldn't want to say a drug of abuse, but it certainly is a recreational drug. Not only the shamans are doing this, but people just are doing it. And you just see people leaning against walls with a line of saliva coming out of their mouth. And people just say, oh, he's doing the apina. Oh, okay. And, people in various attitudes of consciousness and unconsciousness. And coca, of course. And which there's not a whole lot to say about coca. It's an interesting example of a psychoactive, non-psychedelic. The minute you hit the Amazon forest, they are so concerned that you've been misinformed about coca. They say, not a drug. This is not a drug. This is a food. This is a good food. This food makes us healthy. And there is some evidence that this is true, that cocaine bears very little resemblance to coca. Coca is not a spectacular experience. What I found was the way coca works is you've been sitting with these people for hours and they're talking in Witoto or some language that you have no hope of understanding. You're just about ready to excuse yourself and go to your hammock, and they drag out the coca, and the way you do it, and this is another thing, people miss the point in South America because they have no idea how much you're supposed to do. Imagine taking a tablespoon and going into a jar or a sack of flour and getting as much flour as you possibly could on a tablespoon. I mean a high-walled tablespoon, So you get like that much coca. You bring it to your mouth. You put it in. It's dry as dust. And the trick is to slime it over and get it into your cheek and hold it there, all without a break in your conversational flow. And, for a honky, the main effort is not to strangle and disgrace yourself in this scene, because it's usually no women. You're in the longhouse with the men, and these guys are, the authentic, bare-ass, scarified folks. And you're trying to fit in and choking to death on this wad of coca. Well, then it dribbles down your throat, and suddenly, these people don't seem so bad. this place doesn't seem so filthy and you don't seem so tired, and maybe you can make out what they're saying, and in fact, maybe you'll just try out a little of what you've picked up on, and, and before you know it, you're the life of the party. And then, about 20 minutes later, you think, well, maybe now I'll knock off, and then like clockwork, they reach for the tin can again and send it around, and they will do this until it's all gone. Now let's see, which way should we go? Let's jump across the water now to Africa. I talked a little about Iboga. Fascinating cult. Very, very similar to ayahuasca in the social patterns that have arisen around it. The way ayahuasca is taken in the Amazon, in the mestizo populations that Luna is talking about, is people get together on Saturday nights in windowless sheds to about 1/3 to have the trip, about 1/3 because they have something physically or psychologically wrong with them that they want help from the shaman with, and about 1/3 who are wannabes or just hanging in for the social occasion. And in Zaire and Gabon, where the Iboga cult is operating, this same pattern exists. And these things, ayahuasca and Iboga in Africa, are the major forces resisting conversion to Christianity. I mean, they really are the native people's answer to the missionaries. And as such, they act as a tremendous force for social cohesion. Outside of the Iboga complex in Africa, really, we only have rumors. I mean, you will meet shamans from this place and that place. They even come and have spoken in this school who claim knowledge of extremely powerful plant hallucinogens. But they won't cough up the name or the species or a sample. And until that's done, you have to be very, very skeptical that these things are real. One of the things that was so interesting to me, and I mentioned this morning about how the shamans are like scientists. We would take ayahuasca with these people and sing and cure and go through all these trips and the hallucinations and everything. And then a few 6-7 hours later, as dawn was breaking and all but the most hardcore people had gone back to their huts, the assessing of the trip would begin by everybody. And inevitably, people would say, well, this was pretty good, but I remember a time in the Rio Waijaga when so-and-so made it, and it was like this and like this. And in other words, amazing dope tales. Amazing stories of other trips in other times and places and what had been achieved. So these shamans were consistently engaged in the search for the perfect high. They were not set in a cultural pattern. They were experimentalists, always on the outlook for rumors of new plants, untried combinations, so forth and so on. Returning then to the African situation, there is a complex of plants and suspect hallucinogens in southern Africa in use among the Hottentots, Aboriginal peoples of South Africa, and in the family of the Mesembryanthemaceae, which includes the lithops, the haworthias, these little ground-growing things that look like stones, the so-called rock plants. Well, some of those contain mesembrine. Mesembrine is an alkaloid of some sort with unresearched psychoactivity, but a persistent enough rumor of its use that it should probably be checked on. Well, then when you turn to the Eurasian continent, the largest landmass on the planet, you discover what I referred to before, this surprising poverty of hallucinogenic plants. You get the belladonna complex, the tropanes. You get the opium complex. Opium poppies are native to Southeast Asia, have been used by people in Eurasia at least as far back as the ancient Scythians. I mean, we have accounts in Herodotus which make it clear. And in fact, there's a considerable amount of Greek archaeological material that shows opium diadems and opium poppies being used as ornaments by various goddesses. So it was understood that it was psychoactive, yeah.
Robert Graves makes mention in one of his books that he suggests that ambrosia, the ambrosia of the Greek gods, were actually psilocybin mushrooms. Have you ever come across another allusion to that?
Yes, well, it's an interesting question. It has to do with Eleusis. And as you probably know, Eleusis was a major prophetic mystery site in classical and ancient Greece, where every September a ceremony would be done. And the rule was you could only do it once in your life, so you never got a second shot. And everybody in the Greek world would go at some point in their life. Plato, Aeschylus, Aristotle, the whole gang, everybody had this experience. And at the center of it, something was drunk and something happened. And there's been great argument about what was it and what happened. And Wasson and Hoffman and Ruck, who's a classicist at Cornell, all wanted to argue that it was an ergotized beer. In other words, that on the Eleusinian plain, there was a kind of rye being grown which was infected with a strain of claviceps that was mild enough that it was hallucinogenic without being convulsive or causing miscarriages or something like that. Because if you just go out and gather ergot smut, claviceps purpura, and you should be very careful with it. I mean, these ergot alkaloids can send you into convulsions, some of them, and they're fairly toxic. But it's conceivable that a strain grew on the Eleusinian plain that was made into a kind of beer that was then this hallucinogenic intoxicant. But Robert Graves, who didn't have the kind of public relations machinery that Wasson had a different notion. And he claimed that the surviving recipes of the sacrament at Eleusis, and there were, I think, 4 examples of surviving recipes, all called for the same ingredients. And don't hold me to it, but I think the ingredients were barley, honey, water, and something else, hyssop maybe. And he pointed out that a recipe for beer in Greece would never specify water because you understand that water is part of beer. So he said these words were code words, and that in Greek, the first initial of these 4 words could be arranged to spell the word muco, which is mushroom. Mucus, the part of the Indo-European language family believes mushrooms are slimy. This is why the word mucus can be traced back to the word myco, mushroom, mykonos, Mycenae. In fact, means the land of the mushrooms. And so the role of mushrooms in generating the religions of early Greece is a completely unexplored area. It's never been fully thought through. And this is called an ogam, by the way, where you take the first letter of a list, and the first letter of the items of a list spells out a secret meaning. And it was a favorite trick of Irish bardic poets, which Graves was very much into that. But now here's a great project for somebody. We need someone to prove that you can brew a hallucinogen out of claviceps on rye. I mean, this ergotized beer rap, it's just a phrase until somebody puts the stein on the table in front of you. I mean, it would go a great distance toward trying to prove their case. Someone should go to the Eleusinian plain and see if they can still find any cereal grains growing there, and if so, can they infect them with claviceps, or is there claviceps in the area? Now, there's a problem here. I understand there's an oil refinery where the Eleusinian mysteries used to be practiced, but even in California, one could at least take a step toward understanding this, because we have in California a species of grasses called Spartina. Spartina grows, there's quite a population of it on the cliffs above the sea just north of Santa Cruz. Well, Spartina could support Claviceps purpura as an organism. So why not grow Spartina and attempt to infect it with a mild strain of ergot, which you could get from the American Type Culture Collection or something like that? See if an ergotized beer could be brewed. The absence of mushrooms in these places does not disprove the theory, because all of the Mediterranean has been drying out throughout historical times. And there are Greek vases and friezes which do show mushrooms in situations that are ambiguous as to whether or not they're being venerated or exactly what is happening. Now let me see if I've missed anything. I mentioned the Argyria complex in India. That's the Hawaiian baby wood rose. Now that's an interesting one, and I'm always on the alert for these. I'm interested in unclaimed indole complexes. In other words, why was Argyria nervosa never utilized by anybody? It's extremely powerful. You only have to take 8 or 9 seeds, and you don't have to prepare it at all. Just chew it up and swallow it. How come? No cult, no impact on the history of ideas. Well, we don't know. Those 13 species of Argyria are spread from India down through Polynesia. And it's called Hawaiian baby wood rose, but it was introduced into Hawaii 100 years ago. It has nothing to do with Hawaii.